my friends, and welcome to our video lecture on topic D3.1 Reproduction in Plants. There's a separate video lecture for reproduction in animals. Our guiding questions: how does asexual or sexual reproduction exemplify themes of change or continuity? And then what changes within organisms are required for reproduction? Lots of objectives today. We're going to define what even are flowering plants. We're going to talk a lot about flowers today. We're going to distinguish between sexual and asexual reproduction. We'll talk about the structures and functions of flowers. We'll talk about how pollen is made and how eggs are made in plants. We're going to distinguish between pollination and fertilization. We'll talk about the structures and functions of seeds. We're going to talk about flowers that are pollinated by insects. We'll distinguish between self-pollination and cross-pollination and talk about some of the mechanisms involved in self-incompatibility to prevent that self-pollination. We're going to distinguish between pollination and seed dispersal. Notice there's a little bit of repetitiveness here. Pollination, seed dispersal, and fertilization. We're also going to wrap up with a little look at how baby plants grow. Our focus today is going to be on reproduction in flowering plants. Please know that there are lots of plants, conifers, ferns, bryophytes, mosses, that don't make flowers but do have reproductive processes. Our focus is going to be all about angiosperms and flowers and how they are adapted for reproduction. We'll talk more about these different phyla of plants in our unit on biodiversity and evolution. Many organisms are able to reproduce both sexually and asexually. This lovely spider plant is doing just that. Asexual reproduction is when there is only one parent and the offspring are clones, genetically identical clones of that parent plant. All of these little shoots are plantlets. They are offspring of the parent plant, but they are clones of that parent. It's a great way for the plant to spread out. It is not a great way for genetic diversity in the species. That genetic diversity comes from sexual reproduction, which happens in the tiny little flowers that are stuck up here on this plant. In those flowers, we have eggs and there are sperm, and then that fertilization is a mixing of genetics of multiple parents. And this is how we get that lovely genetic diversity that comes from sexual reproduction. We're going to talk lots and lots about sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and that is the work of flowers. The flowers are the reproductive structures of flowering plants. The most noticeable part of flowers are petals. The job of the petal is to attract some pollinators. We're going to attract pollinators. Sometimes the petals are big enough for the pollinators to even land on so that they can get to the nectar and also transfer some pollen. The stamen is the male part of the flower. It consists of two pieces, the anther and the filament. The anther is where pollen is produced. Inside pollen grains are sperm cells. The job of the filament is to hold that anther up high so that when a pollinator comes along, the pollen grains will stick to the pollinator. The pistil, which we also call the carpel. So the carpel or the pistil is the female part of the flower. The top of it is the stigma. I like to call it the sticky stigma because it's sticky. And it's sticky so that when a pollinator comes along with some pollen grains stuck to it, the pollen will actually stick to the sticky stigma. The style holds that stigma up so that it does come into contact with those pollinators that are hopefully transferring some pollen. At the bottom of the style, the bottom of the carpel, we have the ovary, and then within the ovary there are ovules. In the ovules, this is where eggs are produced. This is also where fertilization will occur, and then seeds will develop. We've got some sepals. Sepals are these leaves. Their job is to protect the flower as it's growing. We have the stem, sometimes called the peduncle. We will also sometimes have rolling around in here some nectaries. And the job of the nectaries is to have some nectar, which will also attract those pollinators. You might be asked to draw and label or annotate a flower. Make sure that you can draw a stem and have some sepals and have a stigma with a style and an ovary and some ovules. Make sure that you've got some stamens that have filaments and anthers You can draw a couple of those. And then of course, make sure that you've got some flower petals. That is a lovely diagram of a flower. You will, if you're asked to label it, definitely make sure that you label. We have the stem, which we could also call the peduncle. We've got sepals. We have the ovary, and in the ovary is the ovule. And then here's the style, and here's our stigma. And all of these together, ooh, not the sepals, all of these together, this is the carpel or the pistil. And then of course we've got an anther and we've got a filament, and these together are the stamens. These are the male parts of the flowers. And then we've got some petals. If you are asked to annotate a diagram of a flower, make sure that you add some functions. Petals, again, attract those pollinators. Stigma is going to collect pollen grains. Ovules make the eggs. Sepals are for protection. Anthers are going to produce pollen. We're going to talk a little bit more on the next couple slides about how even do those plants make pollen and how do they make the eggs in the ovaries. Pollen production again occurs in the anthers on top of the filaments. The whole thing is called a stamen. The stamen is the male part of the flower. We're going to look what's happening here in the anther. There are some diploid cells known as microspore mother cells. They are diploid or 2N cells. They go through meiosis. We end up with some haploid cells. These 1N chromosome number cells. There's a tetrad of them, a foursome. Each one of these 4 cells is going to become a pollen grain. What's kind of cool, these pollen grains that are haploid, they're going to go through mitosis. And they're going to go from haploid to, they're going to stay haploid. So now we have these pollen grains that have gone through mitosis. So now they have 2 nuclei. One of those nuclei is going to be a pollen tube nucleus. Its job is to express some genes involved in the development of this pollen grain and also in fertilization. The other nucleus, this generative nucleus, it's going to be the nucleus that isn't going to be involved in fertilization. And in fact, we're going to talk about how it goes through mitosis one more time. We end up with 2 of these generative nuclei right before fertilization occurs. Egg production occurs in the female part of the flower, and we're going to call that female part the carpel or the pistil. The carpel has a sticky stigma at the top. Its job is to collect the pollen grains. There's a style. It holds up the stigma. And we've got this lovely ovary, and in the ovary there will be 1 or more ovules. In the ovules, we've got some diploid mother cells, just like in pollen production. It's going to go through some meiosis, just like pollen production. We're going to have a tetrad for haploid cells, just like in pollen production, and that's where the similarities stop. So instead of all 4 of those haploid cells going on to produce gametes, only one of them is going to. That one cell is going to go through mitosis 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. We're going to end up with 8 nuclei in this megaspore. Then we're going to have a little bit of cytokinesis, so we'll go to multiple cells. We're going to have 1 cell that has 1, 2 nuclei, and then we're going to have that 1 egg cell. We're going to talk about how these guys, these polar nuclei, are involved in the production of endosperm. Endosperm is going to be the food source in the seed, and then of course the egg is going to be fertilized to produce the new baby plant. But before fertilization can occur, we must have some pollination. Fertilization follows pollination. Pollination is simply the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma, often done with the help of a pollinator like this beautiful bee here. He's going to drink some nectar from this lovely plant. Some of those pollen grains are going to get stuck to him. He flies over to the next flower to drink some more nectar. The pollen grains that were stuck to his body are now going to get stuck to the sticky stigma of this other flower. Pollination has occurred. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. After pollination, we can now have some fertilization. What happens in fertilization? That pollen grain that got here via pollination, the pollen grain that is stuck to the sticky stigma, is going to start to grow a pollen tube. This is done with genes in that pollen tube nucleus that's inside the pollen grain. As that pollen tube grows, the other nucleus, the generative cell, is going to travel down the pollen tube. Crazy cool thing, it goes through mitosis one more time, and we end up with 2 sperm cells inside the pollen tube. That pollen tube is going to grow down the style and then through the ovary all the way into one of those ovules. In the ovule, one of those sperm cells is going to fertilize the egg. That is fertilization. Fertilization is egg meets sperm, and the result is a zygote. That zygote is now diploid. We're back to a diploid 2N cell, and this is going to go through lots and lots of mitosis and become the embryo, the baby plant. But wait, what about that second sperm cell that was in that pollen grain? Well, it's also going to fuse with a cell. So that cell that those polar nuclei were in, where we already had 2 nucleus. We already had 2 nuclei in this one cell. Well, now we have 3, and that makes this cell triploid, or 3N. This cell is going to go through lots and lots of mitosis to produce the endosperm. Endosperm is the food of the seed. The ovule is going to develop into the seed with that zygote that's going to become the embryo, the baby plant, and lots of endosperm, that food that is stored in the seed. The ovary is going to become the fruit. Flowers that are pollinated by insects have a lot of things in common. We're going to talk about what those are now. They usually have very large and brightly colored petals to attract those pollinators. They're going to give off some kind of scent also to attract those pollinators. The pollen grains are going to be large and kind of spiky. That helps them to stick to the bodies of the pollinators. They're going to have nectaries that have basically some sugar water, usually buried pretty deep in the flowers, and that just helps to entice these pollinators to kind of really stick their bodies into the flowers so that the pollen grains on the anthers can stick to their bodies. They're usually going to have some pretty large and sticky stigmas, those big sticky stigmas that will help to collect the pollen grains from other flowers. This is just kind of showing kind of a close-up those nectaries that are way down here. So here we have petals and we have anthers and we have stigma. Those nectaries are way down there. Again, that encourages those bugs, the insects, to really dig down into the flowers. And that just means more pollen grains are going to stick to them. Of course, there are lots of variations in the structures and the colors and the scents of flowers depending on what pollinators they're trying to attract, but these things that they have in common, colors and scents and nectaries, are important to know. We've mentioned a few times already this idea of self-pollination versus cross-pollination. We're just going to add a few more details here. Self-pollination, we have pollen grains on this anther being transferred to the stigma of the very same plant. This is a great backup plan if you are the only flower around, but it is not going to lead to any genetic diversity increase because this is basically inbreeding. The offspring are going to not be very vigorous, and again, no increase in genetic diversity. This is not good for a species. So lots of methods for more cross-pollination have evolved over time because this is beneficial to the species. We talked already about some of those adaptations for pollination, the big brightly colored petals that attract pollinators, the scents that flowers will give off, again, to attract those pollinators. There are also some plants that take things up a notch, and they actually have separate flowers for their male parts and their female parts. So here we have flowers from a zucchini plant. Here we have the pollen grains on the male flower, and this entirely separate flower has the stigma and the style and the ovaries. So we can have same plant, separate flowers, we can move the stamen and the stigmas away from each other. We can take things one step further and actually have entirely separate plants. So this is ginkgo. Ginkgo comes in male ginkgo trees and also female ginkgo trees. So whole entire trees are producing only anthers, only pollen. Whole entire separate trees are female and have the stigmas and the ovules. And so again, no self-pollination possible here at all, since they're entirely different organisms. Other plants will actually have those anthers and their stigmas mature at different times. If the stamens, the anthers, the male parts are maturing first, this is protandry, and then protogyny is if the female parts, the stigma, is maturing first. Some of our flowering plants actually can completely prevent self-fertilization with these amazing genes known as self-incompatibility genes. What happens here, we have in our anther those diploid cells that are going through meiosis to produce those pollen grains. They're going to start diploid, and so they have two alleles, one allele, two allele in their genotype for these S for self-incompatibility genes. If the alleles in the anther cells that are going to produce the pollen grains that have those alleles, if they are matches, S1 and S2 match S1 and S2 of the stigma that these pollen grains land upon, there is no growth of a pollen tube. If the alleles in that parent anther cell produce some pollen grains that are S2 and S3. So now I have a different allele here than I have in the plant that these pollen grains land upon. Then the not matching pollen grain alleles are able to grow those pollen tubes, and we do have a little bit of fertilization occurring, partially compatible. Should the alleles of the parent anther be completely different from the alleles of the carpel, well, then all of those pollen grains are able to grow their pollen tubes, and fertilization can occur from all of the pollen grains. So we have to have not matching alleles in order to increase that genetic diversity in order for those pollen tubes to even grow so that fertilization can occur. And should fertilization occur, the ovule is going to develop into seeds. Seeds include the embryo, the baby plant that is developing from that zygote, that fertilized egg and sperm. The embryo is going to consist of a couple different pieces. We've got a radicle. The radicle is the baby root. The plumule is the baby shoot. And we're also going to have in between, kind of like a baby stem, the epicotyl and the hypocotyl. There are also cotyledons and endosperm. These are the food reserves for the growing embryos inside the seeds. These guys developed from the fusion of that second sperm cell with the polar nuclei, that one cell in the ovule that had the two nuclei already in it. Once those seeds mature, we need to spread them out. Seed dispersal is the movement of the seeds away from the parent plant. The benefit is that we don't want the embryos inside the seeds growing in the same place as the parent plants, because then they are competing for the same resources, and this is not good for a species. We can spread our seeds around with some wind, like these lovely dandelions. I'm sure all of us have at least once in our lives blown on those dandelion seeds, gotten them to spread around a little bit. Plants might take advantage of water. Water lilies will drop their seeds into the water and they just kind of float away. Animals, including birds, super helpful for spreading seeds around. We might have squirrels with their nuts, or birds might eat some fruits and then they poo out the seeds, and then the seeds land away from the parent plant. Sometimes seeds will actually have like little hooks on them and they'll get stuck in animal fur and then get dropped someplace else. Sometimes the seed pods will dry out and then just rupture, and the seeds literally fly away from the parent plant. And once those seeds are dispersed, germination can occur. Germination is, of course, the growing of the plant out of the seed. Lots of different plants have lots of different specific conditions needed for germination to occur, but in general, there are three important things that need to be in place. Number one, there needs to be some water. That water is going to rehydrate enzymes. It's going to rehydrate the starch that's stored in the endosperm. That starch is there to feed the growing embryo. We're going to need the right temperature. That is going to allow the enzymes to function at their maximum capacity so that we have lots of ATP and lots of gene expression occurring so that the embryo can grow. And of course, we're also going to need some oxygen. That oxygen is important for cellular respiration because plants do have mitochondria. That's going to make that ATP so that all of these growing things can happen. The food that's in the cotyledon is going to get broken down by amylase. It's going to be used to make lots of ATP. Usually the radicle, the baby root, is going to emerge first. That baby root is going to have a positive response to gravity. So it's going to grow toward gravity. The hypocotyl is going to come next. The hypocotyl is like that baby stem, kind of, sort of. So it's going to pop out, and then the rest of the plant is going to straighten out. We're going to have negative response to gravity. We're moving away from gravity. And then those true leaves are going to start to grow. Photosynthesis is going to occur. All of the growth that continues to occur in the shoots and in the roots comes from meristem. Meristem are the stem cells of the plants. Notice that the roots get more complex, lots of branches, lots of root hairs for more absorption of more water and minerals. And on that note, my friends, we have accomplished all of our objectives. We defined what even are flowering plants. We distinguished between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. One parent needed, two parents needed. We talked about structures and functions of flowers. We talked about pollen production in the anthers and egg production in the ovules. Pollination is the transfer of pollen. Fertilization, egg meets sperm. We talked about all the different pieces and parts of seeds. We talked about what flowers that are pollinated by insects have in common. We talked about the importance of cross-pollination versus self-pollination. We talked about how self-incompatibility can help to prevent that self-pollination. We talked about how pollination is not the same as seed dispersal. And we talked about how those baby plants can grow in germination. Great work today, my friends.